Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm James Haig, part of the K team at AHDB Dairy, and today I'm joined by our strategic dairy farm in Cumbria, Adrian Bland. Morning, Adrian.
Morning.
And also vet from the University of Nottingham, James Breen. Morning, James.
Good morning. Good morning, James. Good morning, Adrian.
We'll be looking today at just having an update from Adrian. It's been a long time since we've been in touch with Adrian since the launch meeting, and also just addressing a bit of a cell count issue that Adrian's been experiencing in his autumn block herd. But first of all, we've been attending these webinars for some months now. I'm sure everybody knows the score, but just in case we've got anybody that hasn't joined us for a webinar before, a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone on the webinar is muted, so please don't try and unmute yourself. This webinar will be recorded and available on YouTube to watch afterwards. If anybody's listening now or on the recording, if you are registered with Dairy Pro, provide us with your farm name, postcode and Dairy Pro number, either in the message box or email me, and we can make sure that you receive your points. For those that are listening live today, even though you're muted, there is a chat function where you can type questions and comments in the message box, which I'll show you how to do on the next slide. But discussion is very much encouraged. We want this to be a two-way thing. If we don't get round to answering your question on the webinar, we will email you with a response once the webinar is over. And just to reassure everyone that these messages are private to us only, we won't mention your name, so don't worry if you think that the question you're asking is a silly question. Please make sure that you're interacting with us. If you want to ask a question, you'll see the box to the right hand side of the screen, I think it is. Just click the arrow in the orange box highlighted by the green arrow pointing towards it. Then this will open up the chat function. Click the white arrow to open the questions box. Type your question where the big oval green circle is, and click on send, and we'll have your questions, which we'll put forward to James and to Adrian. Just in terms of a follow-up offering that we've got from today, we're looking for other autumn block calving levy payers who'd like the opportunity to join Adrian, just to sort of follow up on today's discussion with James Breen as well. We're having a bit of an impact group on Wednesday the 25th of November, just to delve a little bit deeper into the topic that we're discussing today. This will be over Microsoft Teams, so everybody will have the chance to chat between one another, and if you'd like to be a part of that, then please do express your interest to me. My email address is on the screen now, and I'll give it to you later on in the meeting as well. So Adrian is part of our strategic dairy farm network. We've got 18 farms that have signed up, and we're launching about 5 more over the next few months. It was our target to have about 25 over 2020, but this has been hampered somewhat by COVID. Now, these farms are a cross-section of our optimal dairy systems approach to encouraging levy payers to compare their own figures with that of our block calving herds or all year round calving herds with their KPIs. And it's our hope that meetings such as today provide two-way feedback in terms of an update from what the farm is doing and you being able to provide input. You'll notice that there's 2 red stars in the southwest of Wales, and this is an area that we're looking to recruit more strategic dairy farms just to develop our network. So if you are interested or you know of someone that might be suitable, please do let us know. Now, the Farm Excellent pages on the AHDB website continue to develop with reasons to follow each of our strategic dairy farms, and they also provide links to for further help for levy payers who have similar issues or aligned to a particular strategic dairy farm. We're trying to build up the stories of these strategic dairy farms. Behind these, we've got the meeting recordings from events such as today, and top tips from the consultants who have presented at previous meetings. And we would urge you to visit these pages and find a farm that suits your system to follow the journey and to have input into the direction yourself as well. Also within that website, there's what we call optimal dairy systems. Hopefully you've all heard of that by now, and it's a big part of aligning the strategic dairy farms and encouraging people to measure. AHDB set up a system where people can measure against 9 different KPIs, and this is helped with our launch of this kpapiexpress tool. We've had positive feedback about this, and basically what it does is gives you the opportunity to put your info in from your farm data and compare that against industry KPIs and targets. The website address for the kpapiexpress tool is on the screen now, and if you need any support from myself or any of my colleagues, do contact us. All our details are on the website. Just to show you what the tool looks like once you put your info in, you'll see the bar in the middle of the screen going from red to the left, green to the right. This sort of gives you, once you've run your report, it'll show you where you are benchmarks against the industry targets, from excellent, good, above average to below average. The box in the middle of the screen also gives you some links to helpful tools within our AHDB Dairy website, which might be of use to you if you want to particularly improve in a certain area. I really would encourage anyone that's listening to have a look at this, to use it. Contact us if you need any help, and yeah, hopefully it will help just focus on those areas that you need to improve. So that's it from me to start off with. I'd like to pass over to Adrian. As I said at the start, Adrian, we had our launch meeting back in January when life seemed a little bit more normal. Perhaps if you could just give us a bit of an update, Adrian, what you've been up to, what's been happening at the farm, and also a bit of a background to why we're meeting today. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's been very strange times, hasn't it, for us all? Just a quick rundown of what's been going on this year. We turned our cows out 14th of March, which we're quite pleased about. Paddock grazing them. The summer was very dry, so we did very well with our covers, getting them down. Probably slightly to the detriment of production. The cows haven't been milked as well this summer as they have in the past couple of summers. I think that's probably, we pushed them a bit harder to get the paddocks down in the dry weather. So we maybe have to be mindful of that for next year to make sure we keep our production up. And yeah, so we started drying off mid-June, start calving middle of August. Yeah, as the calving season went on, our cell count slowly crept up and up and up till we got to end of October, and it was a bit problematical, which is when we had this conversation with James, and where we are now. Just doing some checking back, 44% of my cows are 4th lactation and above. So I'm suspecting over the last 2-3 years our cell count has crept up at calving, probably been increased by the number of older cows we have in the herd. We've been a bit blasé maybe and ignored it in the past, and it's generally just come down on its own. This year we've obviously realised that we have to be more manage the situation so as it doesn't happen again. We also had a few heifers come in this time that were blind on 1 quarter. Not 100% sure why. We haven't quite got to the bottom of that yet. We did have a heifer that had, which we haven't had for a long time, that got into the habit of sucking all its mates. That is now not with us, so that solved that problem, but has left us with a bit of a legacy. Other things that we did this year, we put the maize onto plastic. We decided to do that in the spring. Very pleased with that decision as of now, because my maize is in my pit and my neighbour's maize is still in the field. Given the weather conditions, his maize may be in the field for some time yet. So yeah, we also took a view on the maize. We sprayed it with some fertilizer late on, maybe about middle of July, early August. and that was with the hope to increase the protein level in the maize and increase the production of the maize. That seems to have worked. The jury's still out. We haven't quite got the cows settled in yet on the winter diet. They've only been in at day and night for about 10 days. They came in at nights 1st of September, and I say we were grazing until about 10 days ago. So yeah, we're feeding slightly less protein than we had to last year, and I think we can probably pull that back a little bit more. So the cost of the liquid fertilizer on the maize certainly seems to have paid for itself and more besides. So I say, yeah, jury's still out on that, but at the moment it's looking like a good decision is that one. Yeah, and as of Monday next week, we'll start breeding again. The season starts again. I'll start AIing all the cows and heifers. Hopefully we'll be successful as last year. This year we're going to go with sex semen for the first cycle, first 21 days. 80–85% of the cows will get sex semen, and then we've actually bought a sexed beef bull, and we will use that after we've finished serving with the sexed dairy sires, because I keep my bullocks myself, and the bullocks generally are worth about 150–200 pound a head more a 2-year-old than the heifers. So obviously the more bullocks we get born, the better. So yeah, we're going to give it a go and see what happens. But yeah, that's sort of basically a bit of a rundown what we've been up to and where we are today.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So we're going to now pass over to James Breen. James, if you want to start sharing your slides. Yeah. Just to remind everyone, we've got a good number of people listening in. We do want to try and make today as interactive as possible. We'll be taking questions throughout the presentation and discussion with James and Adrian this morning. So if there's anything that you want to know or put to either of the two people on the panel, please do put them into the chat function, and I'll forward them on to James and Adrian. But James, passing over to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks to you and Adrian for inviting me along, and with a sort of specific reference, I guess, to talking a little bit about cell counts in some more detail, and a little bit about the current issue, as it were. I realise there's a fair few people on the call, and I guess I wanted to go back a little bit to talking perhaps and setting the scene a little bit, what are cell counts? And this is something that all dairy herds, vets and advisors will tend to talk about a lot, but a little bit about what cell counts actually are, and then moving on to understanding the pattern, cell count infection patterns in your herd. So we'll obviously be focusing more specifically on Adrian's herd, and a little bit about perhaps thoughts on the management at Adrian's farm, and that'll inevitably, I think, bring us more to the dry period. Interesting to hear Adrian then talking about some heifers that have calved in with blind quarters, and certainly the reasons why that happened. Well, certainly infection can be one of those, and infection during the dry period, as it were. Heifers don't have a dry period obviously as such, but they will be very susceptible to infection prior to calving. So we'll sort of do it in that way, if that's all right with everyone on the call. I've got a little example, again, thinking in terms of autumn calving herds, and some of you on the call, you may share the same calving pattern as Adrian. I've got a little example of cell count control, as it were, out of a herd from North Nottinghamshire. But we may get to that, or we may end up talking a little bit more with Adrian and sort of leaving it there. But that's what I sort of propose we do. So by way of introduction, I guess, when Adrian was talking to me about cell count and some of his comments there about some older cows in the herd, and maybe some of these cows need to go, or we've sort of let things run their course and the cell counts come back down a bit, and it seemed to be okay. I think people often do take the view that mastitis control is relatively simple, and we sort of either things will get better on their own, or we'll cull a few cows and it will quiet down again. I think the first statement that the group at Nottingham, that I sort of represent here today, Andrew and Martin and others will tell you, current infections, cows that are infected and a high cell count, they will get better during the dry period, or they're very likely to get better during the dry period. And I think we still underestimate the chance of cure across the dry period, even older cows. And I think with that in mind, we often then say, I guess mastitis control is simple in the fact that it is therefore about prevention. Most cows will cure during a dry period, so therefore the name of the game is to stop them becoming infected again. Now, whether that's going to happen when they're dry or when they're milking, but the name of the game is prevention, as with most things. And I guess that leads us on to saying, well, where do new infections come from? And we still tend to, particularly with cell count actually, which is quite interesting, we tend to still think about infection from other infected cows. The whole contagious mastitis model is more readily understood. I think we still tend to think about that first and foremost. If I've got some high cell count cows, they might spread it, in inverted commas, whatever it is, they might spread that infection to uninfected herd mates. And that leads us down the line, with cell count problems, we inevitably start in the parlour. We tend to do things like changing dips, we tend to sort of clean clusters, disinfect, whatever, and we often end up treating and culling some cows, and it tends to be a bit reactive. And of course, particularly with the treatment side of things, we've got to be careful with antibiotic treatments, depending on what sort of contracts we're on and that sort of thing. Not to mention the fact it's kind of unsustainable, really, to do this. So we tend to think about infections from other cows. Of course, for the majority of herds, we know from years of doing the mastitis control plan, actually for the bulk of UK dairy herds, contagious mastitis patterns tend to be very uncommon. It's not that they are not seen at all, but they tend to be very uncommon as the predominant mechanism, if you like, whereby we generate new infected cows. And of course, what is much more common is the whole environmental infection pattern, and this will be very familiar to lots of you I know, infection acquired from the environment. Again, we tend to think about housed environments, and yes, bedding, loafing space, ventilation, cubicle management, whatever it is, are obviously very important, but we mustn't neglect the fact that cows will become infected in pastured environments as well. That's often a bit underestimated, if I'm honest, and not only milking cows, but also dry cows in paddocks. And all these environments, housed, outdoors, yards, cubicles, whatever it is, they can be a real challenge to manage year round. We've just come off the back of a very hot summer, challenging conditions, whether you had cows in a paddock or cows in a housed environment, temperatures of 30 degrees plus are very, very difficult to manage. So I guess a major change in the way we tended to approach mastitis control in the last 20 years or so, we would have a meeting like this and we would tend to take a one-size-fits-all approach. So we'd chat with Adrian about what he does. We'd maybe say, well, that sounds good, and we'd all go away and do it. Or we'd make a few recommendations to Adrian and everyone would go home and do the same thing as well. Very generic approaches, that all dairy herds would do. We talk about cubicles, or we talk about pre-dipping or something, and we'd say, well, right, we've all got to go away and do that. And this very blanket sort of approach. And of course, we know that doesn't work. The top-down approach where we say, right, you all go away and do the same thing, the research would suggest that doesn't work. And that shouldn't really surprise us, because all farms are different, of course. Their pathogen profiles, their patterns of infection management, they are all very different. Adrian is very different to the rest of you on the call. So a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. And of course, what we do is we take a very specific approach, herd by herd. So I need to understand something about Adrian's current management. We need to put that together with patterns in the data from cell counts and mastitis events, bit of bacteriology and the like. And we need to come up with a specific set of control measures that are aimed at slowing down new infections at a particular time. Of course, that may change. We may talk about something else, in 6 months' time, but it's very ground up. It's very herd by herd basis. And that was the research, and this was the stuff that led to the mastitis control plan, you know, that's actually now 15 years old. It started off life when it was the Milk Development Council. So Andrew and Martin came up with this rather catchy mastitis diagnosis and control, MDC. And then of course you promptly went and changed the name to Dairy Co. So we kept it as a mastitis control plan. And we worked together and focused very much on the data and the current management for a particular herd. So I guess if we turn our attention to Adrian's herd, you know, and indeed your herds, you know, those of you on the call, we're talking about cell counts in this particular context. But it's really important, you know, I'm not going to spend the next half an hour or so talking about some of Adrian's cows that are already infected and what we do about them. These cows will cure during the dry period. You know, we can get creative and start throwing tubes at them and things, but it's not going to get us anywhere long term. And in fact, what we really want to focus on, and I'm guessing Adrian's still got cows left to carve in, you know, where do new infections come from? What's going to happen now over the next few months? Because if we can use the milk recording data and the clinical mastitis data, even if we're predominantly focused on a high cell count herd, I'd really encourage you, we have to have clinical mastitis events as well. We need both to understand the predominant pattern. Because a crucial part of any of this sort of thing is we need to be able to categorize the herd. Are we predominantly dealing with something around Adrian's herd, which means cows tend to get infected when they're dry? Or is it something that tends to happen when Adrian's herd are in lactation? Because it shouldn't be a massive surprise, of course, that control measures would be very different. If we end up talking about the dry period, clearly what we do about it's going to be very different. And knee-jerk reactions like changing teat dips in the parlor or disinfecting clusters or whatever it is are going to be absolutely no value whatsoever to us. So we need to be very clear about this. So that's by way of a bit of introduction. I guess Adrian flags up, right, cell counts. You know, I've got a problem with cell counts. I suppose just for a few minutes, what are cell counts then, I suppose? What are we dealing with when we talk about my cell count is up, down, high, low? Of course, we're talking about white blood cells in milk, leukocytes, and there's lots of different types, macrophages, neutrophils. The type of white blood cell that turns up in the milk depends on whether or not the cow is infected or not with a major pathogen. You know, we tend to talk about major bacterial pathogens, don't we? Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, E. coli, and the like. These are major bacterial infections which can cause infection in the gland, in the udder, and then that causes influxes of white blood cells. So you've got some pictures of white blood cells there on the right-hand side. The one in the middle there, the sort of purpley, pinky one, in the uninfected gland, so in cows that are uninfected with a major pathogen, they could have other bits and pieces in there, but they don't have a strep hubris causing havoc or an E. coli or whatever. The cell type is mainly macrophages. These are, if you like, scouting for infection. They'll be there. The cow is running a very low cell count. And of course, if they're uninfected, they could become infected. So they are, you could argue, quite susceptible to infections, some cows more than others, particularly high yielding cows in early lactation, in negative energy balance, they're quite susceptible. But particularly cows in the late dry period, they're incredibly susceptible. You know, cows that are towards the back end of the dry period, colostrogenesis is happening, immune function tends to be a bit poor in the late dry period. They're also incredibly susceptible to new infection. And if infection happens, well, then the infected gland, what happens is you get an influx of a different cell type, these neutrophils, the bottom right there. And these are the killers, if you like. These are cells that engulf and remove bacteria. Think of it as an army. But they've got to get there quickly. They've got to get from the cow's bloodstream. They've got to get into the udder. They've got to cross the barrier between the blood and the milk. And they've got to do something about the bacterial infection. They may get on top of that infection, in which case the bacterial numbers will come down. and therefore the numbers of cells will come down. Her cell count will drop. They may get partially on top of things, and the bacterial numbers come down a bit, so the cell count comes down a bit, but then the infection's not really removed as such, so the bacterial numbers will start to multiply up again, so the cell count comes back up again, and you get this waxing and waning. The cell count goes down a bit, comes up a bit, goes down a bit, comes up a bit, and effectively we're stuck. This cow is still infected and we're a bit stuck. So that's what cell counts are. They vary a lot, don't they? And I think that's another sort of reason why we sometimes are not quite sure what's going on with some of these cows. Infection status on the left there is absolutely key. The #1 driver of cell count in a cow will be whether or not she's infected. So a cow with a high cell count, it's probably infection. But there are some other things that do really affect it. So Adrian's saying he's an autumn block calving herd. He'll have cows that are 300 odd days in milk, and their cell count will start to creep up a bit, for sure. And I think that's important when we look for patterns in the data. We've almost got to focus on early lactation in particular, and sometimes be able to see the wood for the trees a little bit. So days in milk will tend to increase cell count as we lose a bit of yield and we lose that dilution effect. Lactation number, Adrian talks about older cows. He's got 4th lactation plus cows. And yes, this means that as the lactations increase, the cow starts a little bit higher. So her cell count at first test will be a little bit higher than it was at first test in the previous lactation. But that doesn't mean just because she's a 4th lactation cow, she starts with a cell count of 500,000. Not at all. We're talking relatively higher here. And it means she ends relatively higher. But again, it doesn't mean she ends with a cell count of 500,000 just because she's 5th lactation cow. Lactation number means that our chance of cure across a dry period may drop a little bit. It certainly means our chance of cure if we're trying to treat her during lactation will be harder. And there's also time of year effects. Summer in particular can be a more difficult time of year controlling cell count, because we think that you'll get more chronic infections as we change pathogen. We may have more strep ubris type infections in the summer with pastured environments particular than we may get in the winter. But we also see time of year effects between sort of housing and pasture with higher temperatures, higher humidity, and that sort of thing. And of course, then there's many others, things like, frequency of milking, things like physiological variation day to day, things like lab effects, that sort of thing. But the key ones are over on the left-hand side: infection status, days in milk, age of the cow in particular. Okay. Just to illustrate that, I've got 2 cows here from a herd in Somerset, and they're both the same days in milk. So I've got 2 cows here that are 300 odd days in milk, but that cow is a 2nd lactation cow. And there's her last 3 cell counts: 1.3 million, 1.5 million, 1.4 million. So cell counts are times 1,000. So once you see a cell count of 1,000, it's actually 1 million. So there are 3 cell counts. All her last 3 cell counts are above 1 million. Compare her to this cow that's a similar stage of lactation. She's 300 days in milk as well, but she's a lot older. She's a 7th lactation cow. And her last 3 cell counts are sort of knocking on the door at 200. This is just to illustrate really that the top cow is far more likely to be infected with a major pathogen than the bottom cow. Her cell counts are a lot higher, and she's a younger cow than the older cow at the bottom there, where her cell counts are knocking on the door at 200. She's less likely to be infected with a major pathogen. She could be, but this could also be a combination of her lactation number and her days in milk. But despite this variation, I think it's really important, despite this variation, we can still make decisions. Cell counts are not useless. We can still make decisions about cows using cell count data. Just a quick nod to the threshold thing, because you'll find this changes sometimes depending on what software you're using, or we might sort of alter things a little bit. But the 200,000 thing that line in the sand. There is method in the madness. It's a very commonly used cutoff. The reason being is it's got around about a decent sensitivity and specificity. In other words, we're quoting a percentage figure there, but in other words, cows that have a cell count above 200,000, 3 out of 4 times they're probably infected, in round figures. For cows that have a cell count below 200,000, 3 out of 4 times they're probably not infected. So if they're above 200, they probably are. If they're below 200, they're probably not. It's not a certainty. And of course, the way you increase your certainty is you don't just look at one cell count, you look at several. And I would urge you when making decisions around cows, particularly around drying off, that we look at the last 3 recordings. Because if you look at the last 3 recordings and they're all below 200,000, for example, it's very, very unlikely your cow is infected with a major pathogen. Your certainty is now somewhere around 90% plus. Okay, but there is science behind the threshold of 200,000. I want to spend a little bit of time on this one because when Adrian sort of got in touch, we spoke about cell count a bit. You have this idea that the bulk cell count is high or increased, and we sort of then have a bit of a right, what do I do about it? But we've got to think about the drivers of bulk cell count, and this is one of Andrew's slides acknowledging Andrew Bradley there at the bottom. Andrew explains it very nicely this way by thinking about, right, we've got an output. So your bulk cell count is your output. That's the end result, if you like. That's what you see. But it's made up of things that input into that. But then we've got to go back one level again and say, well, what drives those things? So if we think about the inputs, what goes into the pot, as it were, into the bulk tank? Well, in there is all your uninfected cows. So these are the cows with cell counts below 200, and Adrian will have plenty of those. All the infected cows, these are the cows with cell counts above 200. And of course, some of those we know will be chronically infected. In other words, they're above 200 and they always have been, or have been for quite some time now, at least the last 3 recordings, probably, if not more. So these are the inputs. And what we do, of course, is because we know these are affecting our output, our bulk cell count, is we tend to get a bit excited with lists at this stage. We've gone back that one step. Excuse me, we get a list and we say, right, who are our chronics, who are our infected cows, and we have a little bit of a right, cull her, dry her off, Thailand, whatever it is, shoot, dry off, treat. And we work down the list a little bit, manage the list a little bit, the bulk cell count comes down again, and then we relax. But of course, what we need to remember is that whilst we can play that game, and it is playing the game to some extent, we're managing the prevalence a little bit here, it does not, if you like, sort out the underlying problem. Because in a few months' time, we might have to play that game again. So what we come back to is the drivers. And here are all the things which can drive what we get, where the infected cows come from, beg your pardon. So where our infected cows come from are from these drivers. Now, I've touched on days in milk. Yes, particularly for all year round calving herds, if you like, that really struggle with poor fertility, we've got a lot of stale cows, and that can mess up the cell count a bit. Bottom left, you talk about age of the herd. And Adrian's right, a lot of older cows, because their cell counts will be slightly higher each time they recalve into the herds, that can result in a bit of an issue. But you get the idea front and center there, new infections. Where do our new infections come from? Our uninfected cows become infected, and it's the new infections that are the issue. But because we tend to think about we wait until the cow becomes infected and then we look at our list. And then we think, right, well, we may treat them when they just become high cell count for the first time, because if we treat them when their cell count becomes high for the first time, we might get a better chance of a cure, and we might stop them becoming chronic. And again, we get sort of trapped in that sort of game of, right, I'll just treat them a bit earlier then. I might treat them the first time they go above 200, and I might focus on those so I get less chronics. But it still doesn't come back to the new infections. And there are a few other factors as well, and yeah, factored recordings and cows that we do or don't record and things like that. But I want to focus on that. I really want to focus on new infections. Andrew will tell you, Martin at Nottingham, all the others in the group, it's all about new infections. We need to slow those down. If we make less newly infected cows, well, then ultimately we'll have less chronics and we'll keep the bulk cell count under control. But of course, the new infections, right, well, that's a bit more complicated, isn't it? Because it depends if they're coming out of the dry period or not, or it depends if they're coming out of lactation or not. And for some herds, there's an element of both. So where do you start, if you like? But this process of stepping back one more step, let's just not have a list of high cell count cows and chronics. We need to go back one step further and think about, well, where did they come from? So a plea a bit, please move away from monthly management lists of high cell count cows. I understand we might go through periods of having to play the game in the very, very short term, but this isn't a long-term approach. This is not how we manage cell counts. We manage cell counts by limiting the number of cows that end up on these lists in the first place. And why? I mean, why does this sort of treating high cell count cows while they're still milking thing not work? Why isn't it not a good idea? This was stuff that we did around the mastitis control plan and is still available to mastitis control plan deliverers, as a bit of a decision support tool, not as an excuse to treat high cell count cows, I might add, more to illustrate why it's often not a sustainable route. We know from research that if we're going to treat a high cell count cow while she's still milking, I stress this is not during the dry period, but while she's still milking, the factors that are important are on the left-hand side there. They're very cow level factors. How old she is, how many quarters are affected. If you got in the parlour and California mastitis tested her, she could have 3 quarters affected or whatever. We know that the bulk cell count's important. It's harder to cure high cell count cows if you've got a high bulk cell count. The infection pressure, the chance of reinfecting that cow. Treatment duration is important. Her cell count history is important. So if you take this example where we've got a second lactation cow, so she's relatively young, let's assume she's got a high cell count, we get in the parlour, we California test her, and she's only positive on 1 quarter. So we've got a young cow, high cell count in 1 quarter. We're going to treat her for 4 or 5 days, but her last 3 cell counts have all been above 1 million. Her chance of cure is less than 1 in 3. And this is from research, and it would suggest, therefore, that the cost of treating that cow, we're going to have to treat a cow like that 3 times effectively, slightly more than 3 times. And so the cost of treatment is very high. It's not sustainable use of antibiotic, and of course it's not solving the underlying problem. The underlying problem is how have we ended up with so many like her. So we move away from that. We move away from trying to treat our way out of a problem, because we can't with high cell counts. We cannot treat our way out of that problem. We try and monitor things, and we try and understand how we control it. So what I want to talk about with Adrian shortly is, I'm not particularly interested in how many high cell count cows we have. I'm guessing we've got a few too many. What I'm interested in is the pattern. What's the pattern in his herd? Are we thinking about contagious mastitis actually? Am I worried about that? Am I thinking about environmental patterns? Am I thinking about dry period infections? Am I thinking about infections when the cows are milking? And most of all, I'm thinking about new infections. Where do new high cell count cows come from, in inverted commas? But to do that, I need the cell count data, and this is something Adrian and I talked about. you know, Adrian's gone through a period of not milk recording, you know, so actually we've lost that information. What I can't do is, like I could do in this herd, for example, I could say, right, cow 2240 in this herd, I know is a new infection when she's milking, because I can look at her last few cell counts here over on the right-hand side, and I can say at some point between the 7th of May when she was milk recorded and the 11th of June when she was milk recorded, she's gone from a cell count of 20,000 to 3.1 million. Now, all ends up, that's infection. You know, that's not a days in milk thing. She's only 100 days in milk. It's not an age thing. She's a second calver. This is a new infection. But what I don't want to do is say, right, what do I treat her with? It's not about that. It's about saying, well, I wonder how many other cows have done that between May and June. What's our new infection rate between May and June? What's our new infection rate in the last 3 months? Is this something that always happens between May and June? Is this a seasonal pattern? Do we tend to make a lot of new high cell count cows in milk at this time of year? And if so, how can we slow it down? So this is what I want to do with the sort of data that I would want from Adrian and want from those of you on the call that are interested in this sort of thing. So actually I could just say, right, Adrian, what have we got to play with? And Adrian's done a milk recording on the 14th of October. And yes, the average cell count's a bit high there at 259. And we can sort of start to chop it up a bit and say, well, we've got some cows that are less than 200. We've got some cows that are between this band and this band. I mean, it doesn't really matter if they're 200 to 400 or 400 to 500 or whatever. The fact of the matter is we've got cows above 200,000, so they're likely to be infected. What we really want to know is, when did they become infected? At what point did they move above 200,000? Okay. So at this point then, and I'm conscious of time, sorry, and I just want to get to a point where I can talk to Adrian a bit more. So with that backdrop in mind, let's think about the pattern for a moment. We've got some cell counts. We've got them belonging to individual cows. What's the pattern? How do we know? So of course, for those of you on the call, you've got your milk recording sheets like these ones from NMR. You'd be very familiar with these if you milk recorded NMR. The tempting thing to do is to look at the millionaires, isn't it? You know, we like the millionaires. We like the ones at the top. And we say, right, well, if I shoot a few of those and if I dry a few of them off and if I throw some bottles or whatever at them, you know, I might get them better, in inverted commas. Actually, what you do is you start picking out the ones that are new high cell counts. So over on the left here, I've highlighted a few cows like 816 there at the top on the left-hand side. You can see her cell count, a bit like that last example. She's gone from very low to 500,000. So she's a new high cell count while she's milking. She's a new infection in lactation. And there's a few of her mates that have done the same thing in those red boxes on the left-hand side. But it's not enough to know, well, there's 4 of them. What does that mean? You know, how many of them could there have been? Is that a lot? I also, on the right-hand side, I've picked out a few cows. Let's, for example, look at 722. She's the second one down on the left-hand side in the red box. That's her first milk recording. You notice she's 15 days in milk. She's carved in with a cell count of 500,000. Well, that's not right. You know, she should have carved in with a low cell count with any luck. And there's a few of her mates around her that this is their first milk recording and their high cell count. Well, these are very likely to be dry period infections. You know, they've carved in on the first opportunity we've got to measure their cell count. It's already high. This is very, very likely to be infection they've picked up during the dry period at some point. And so actually I could go to Adrian's data here, and I've just grayed out the actual cow IDs. But I just wanted to look at Adrian's for a moment and say, well, is this the case at Adrian's? If we look at, this is out of Uniform Agri, so Uniform Agri's plonked the cell counts into a table for us, and this is the milk recording on the 14th of October. And I've got the high cell count cows here, and in the blue boxes, these are cows that are around about 30 days or less in milk. And you see this cow was 17 days in milk, and looking along to the right, her cell count's 1.8 million. This cow, this is a heifer actually, and Adrian made the point about a few heifers calving in with problems. Well, here's a heifer, her first milk recording, 32 days in milk, and she's come in with a cell count of 750,000. And another heifer, and another cow, and another cow, calving in with high cell counts. And straight away, I'm thinking, well, there's quite a few there that are calving in with cell counts greater than 200,000, and they're 30 days-ish or less in milk. Really smacks of something out of the dry period, and perhaps we should think about this before we go any further. We'll talk about a little rule of thumb in a moment for how many you'd allow, if you like, you know, and we need to think about the cows that calved in and didn't have a high cell count. But let's think about how many we'd allow, because patterns in the data. So I don't care whether your cell count's high or low, you know, these are the things we should be watching. So if I've got a bunch of dry cows in a loose yard here, this is a herd down in Somerset, plenty of room in this loose yard, very well managed, I'm still going to keep an eye on it. This herd tends to run a low cell count. I'd still chat with Chris every time we do a recording every month. Right, hang on a minute, we've just calved in a bunch of cows. Let's monitor some changes across the dry period. If we dried off a bunch of low cell count, uninfected cows, how many of those have calved in high cell count? Because I don't want more than 10% doing that. If we've dried off a bunch of low cell count cows, no more than 10% of them coming in high. The flip side of that, of course, is if we've dried off a bunch of high cell count cows, we should be curing the vast majority of them, 85, 90%. 8 or 9 out of every 10 cows we dry off with a high cell count should calve in with a low cell count, from above 200 to below 200. So these are the dynamics, and these are the things we watch, irrespective of whatever the bulk cell count is, because guess what? If we start to lose control of this, more cows will calve in with a high cell count. Some of those will go chronic. And if we leave it long enough and it's drip, drip, drip into the herd, leave it long enough, eventually the bulk cell count will start to go nuts. The root of the problem, of course, could have been a year ago, 18 months ago, as we started to lose control of infections out of the dry period. And a quick word about heifers. They could calve in high cell count as well, couldn't they? It's absolutely achievable that less than 1 in 10 heifers can calve down with a high cell count. The average, unfortunately, is more like twice that when you look at lots of herds, and this was published out of Nottingham from Aurelian Madouas 10 years ago, looking at a very large data set, nearly 2,000 herds in 3 years. On average, 18% of heifers were above 200,000 at their first test day. But the best performing herds, the top 10%, if you like, could get that down below 10% of heifers calving in with high cell count. So there must be something they were doing with these heifers pre-calving that meant they were able to calve them in with a low cell count. And if we get that data, of course, we can plot it out a bit and track things. This is a herd, an autumn block calving herd, although they're sort of a bit spread out, this herd, but they'll calve a lot of cows September, October through to sort of Christmas and just after. But we can do a bit of colouring in, we can track it, we can say, well, the yellow bars are all the cows that I dried off with a low cell count, and they've calved back in at that milk recording date. The green bars are how many of them actually calved in with a high cell count. The blue gives me a percentage, and the red line gives me a sort of rolling average percentage. And you can see in this herd in 2019, 2020, so the big lot of yellow bars here in the middle of the chart, the red line's at about 5%. So the new infection rate out the dry period in this herd was 5%. Becky would dry off 20 low cell count cows, and only one of them would calve in with a high cell count on average. Really good performance in that herd. Lost it slightly so far this herd. September and October's milk recordings, Becky's had 3 high cell count cows out of 23 that have calved in so far. We're just above the 10% target line, as you can see. So we're monitoring this. we had a conversation last week about dry cow environments and what's going on, because we don't want it to continue. The flip.
James, could I just interrupt you, just for some
Yeah,
clarity? Questions come in.
Yes.
Those high cell count cows, are you saying that they'll cure by using dry cow therapy or without?
So can I flip on then? So if we're going to measure a cure rate, yes, a high cell count cow at drying off is very likely to cure with antibiotic dry cow therapy in combination with internal teat sealant. So if we're measuring a dry period cure rate in this herd, in the same herd, this is Becky's herd, we just looked at the new infections, the dry period cure rate in Becky's herd tends to be very high. The orange line there is our target of 85%. She routinely will tend to beat that. The dry period cure rate is there or thereabouts. But a stress with antibiotic dry cow therapy in combination with internal teat sealant, and that research was published by Andrew Bradley 10 years ago. We looked at, is it worth putting sealant and antibiotic dry cow in high cell count cows at drying off? And it absolutely is. Combination antibiotic dry cow therapy and internal teat sealant in a high cell count cow at drying off significantly improves your chance of carving that cow in uninfected. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, James.
I realise there's people who are perhaps not using antibiotic dry cow therapy at all. So, you know, there are organic herds on PWAB contracts, you know, producing without antibiotic, or, you know, we're a little bit worried about antibiotic use and we are really scaling it back. And there's a sort of a sense that some of these cows will self-cure, in inverted commas. Some of them will, yes. What I would stress is, do we measure it? So do we actually know that? You know, do we still do our milk recordings? Do we still measure what happens to cows that we dry off above 200,000? What percentage of those are calving in below 200,000? The final point I'd stress is, the other reason that Becky's cure rate is so good is because her new infection rate is so low. And I think people get worried with dry period cure rates. They say, well, I dried off 10 high cell count cows and only 6 of them carved back in with a low cell count, 60%, 6 out of 10. So therefore my tube doesn't work. And I hear vets talk about this still a lot. You know, the Kepravin isn't working, so we use Orbitin Extra, or the Orbitin Extra doesn't work, so we use Kepravin. We have to look at cure rates in the light of new infections. So the fact that Becky's new infection rate is so low here, only 5% of our low cell count cows calve in high, well, that reflects very, very good control of infection during the dry period. And therefore, when we measure a cure rate, we will cure our high cell count cow with the penicillin. But of course, they've got to stay cured for the next 7 weeks or so, haven't they? You know, they've got to stay like that. The sealant's helping you as best it can stay like that. But we've got to also think about the environment these dry cows are in.
Just talking about the environment that the dry cows are in, we've had a question come in, James, about would dry cows be better on sand cubicles, and is it less important to keep them regularly topped up with sand as the milking cows would be?
So the answer to the first part of the question is particularly close to calving cows, but certainly dry cows in general can be very well managed on deep sand cubicles. Yes, and that can work extremely well, particularly in the latter part of the dry period where susceptibility is really high to new infections. So can work extremely well, particularly if you combine it with a sort of just-in-time approach to calving, whereby you can stick them the other side of the gate, you know, 24, 48 hours before they're due to calve, and they calve in a loose box or something. In terms of how you manage those cubicles, I think we would absolutely manage them the same as the milking cows. I think there is often this perception that because they're dry, we don't need to bed up as often. If you've got dry cows in cubicles, they need to be managed at least as well as the milking cows. So if you're not using sand and you're using an organic bedding material, for example, like sawdust, straw, paper, whatever, bedded daily, and that came out of research published around the plan. If you're using sand every other day, some herds will get away with twice a week with sand. I stress though that it's in the light of measuring something, isn't it? So if we're only, in inverted commas, going to bed up the dry cow cubicles with sand once a week, do we measure what the new infection rate is? Because it may be your new infection rate's fine and you're like Becky's here on screen, because there's other things you do around ventilation and space and stocking density and that sort of thing, which means that it's fine. So this is what I mean about giving answers away. If that person wants an answer, the answer is every other day with deep sand, but it's in the light of the new infection rate. So if you're not doing it every other day, that doesn't mean to say it's going to be a disaster, because we need to measure what the new infection rate is. And it may be the new infection rate actually does quite well, only doing it twice a week or even once a week.
Just very quickly, a difficult one to answer without knowing the environment, but a follow-up question to that: if someone was just using rubber mats, would you recommend lime?
Sorry, so rubber mats.
Just using rubber mats, yeah. Would you recommend
no bedding
lime?
material? With no bedding material at all?
I think that's the inference on the question, James. Yes, yeah.
So I wouldn't use rubber mats on their own with no bedding material. I would use bedding material. The lime thing, there is research evidence. It came out of the research published by Andrew and Martin when they looked at 18,000 dry periods out of 52 herds, the 52 herds that were the original plan study, and the addition of lime was associated with, if you like, an improved outcome. So if you can use a bedding conditioner, dry cow cubicles, bedding conditioners. What I would say though is you kind of have to use it daily. So lime twice a week, for example, is unlikely to do very much. Adding lime to your dry cow cubicles every day, particularly in the latter part of the dry period, is probably going to help. I think if you're not using any bedding material at all, I would question cow comfort.
Okay, thank you.
Is that all right?
Just one more question that's come in around bedding.
I realise I've talked quite a lot about how you measure things.
Do you believe bedding treatments can work to reduce the environmental infections occurring?
By bedding treatments, do we mean additives to the bedding, like the sort of sop product for loose yards?
I think that's what I'm reading into this one, James. Yes, yeah. So pre-treated. Yeah.
I am prepared to accept that they may have an effect. What I'm not prepared to say is, do we measure it or not? So there's, for example, if you take the sop product directly, I'm unaware of any published research evidence in a peer-reviewed scientific paper that suggests they work, in inverted commas. So I would tend to be very much of the approach that it's all about fresh, clean, dry bedding on a regular basis. So for example, in the mastitis control plan, clean, dry straw added daily to cubicles or daily to loose yards, clean, dry sawdust added daily, at least, clean sand added 2 or 3 times a week. I wouldn't want to put my faith in additives. I particularly wouldn't go around spraying disinfectant onto the backs of the beds. If, for example, you'll just end up with a wet bed. The disinfectant, will disappear after about 10 minutes, and you've just added more moisture. So I wouldn't tend to think about additives. The only additives I would tend to think about are the sort of bedding conditioners, like the limes and the powders. But again, unless you're going to use them daily, they probably aren't going to have much of an effect, because it's a sort of pH thing as well as a drying effect. And it's sort of a 24-hour thing with lime.
Thanks, James.
All right, no problem. But I stress again, we've got to measure it, haven't it? So this is why I'm spending this time talking about how you measure it, because if we're going to spend a chunk of cash on a sack full of something, well, then we've got to have some way of measuring whether it does any good or not. So this is where you get into a bit more, because it's pointless measuring your bulk cell count, because that's just so insensitive. If we're going to do something to dry cow environments, we've got to be able to measure what happens to a low cell count cow as she goes through the dry period, and what happens to a high cell count cow as she goes through the dry period. So I guess moving on to Adrian's a minute, I'm going to sort of pause here for breath for a minute, but from what data we've got at Adrian's so far, having done a milk recording, a bit difficult because we haven't got the status of the cows as they were when they were dried off. What we have got so far, as you can see there, is a few cows calving in with high cell counts. So let's suggest that some of these could be new infections. Shall we perhaps ask Adrian what happens across the dry period in his herd for a moment, and think about dry cow management? And if there are cows left to calve in, can we nip this in the bud for a moment, or at least try and increase the odds of calving down a cow that has a cell count below 200 at her first test? Can I ask you a little bit about that, Adrian? What's the dry cow management at your herd?
The dry cow management, the last 3 weeks, they're in a bare paddock where we feed them a TMR in a trailer. So yeah, and we only ever use that one paddock because it's close to the yard, easy to keep an eye on them, easy to handle them.
Yes.
Get to this time of year, we do bring them inside onto cubicles, the last few, but we predominantly try and calve outside because we seem to have a lot less calving problems. The cows just basically get on with it, and we go and pick live calves up.
Yes, yes. So actually, then, because there'll be people on the call that also calve outside, and like you say, if your system relies on calving outside as far as possible, so actually, it's probably a good idea to talk more about that than cubicle management and things. You say a paddock close to the house, is that in use for the whole season?
Yes, the same paddock for the whole season.
Yeah. And how large is the paddock, Adrian?
It's about a hectare, 2.5 acres, maybe 3 acres.
So 3 acres, and how many cows would you have in there at any one time? So what's the sort of maximum number of close to calving cows that would be in 3 acres?
Well, we calved this year, it's the fastest we've ever calved, so it was probably the most heavily stocked it's ever been. We got up to about 38 by the time we actually started calving, and then numbers dropped quite quickly. But yeah, in the past we've only ever got to about 20 odd, but because our calving pattern is getting tighter and tighter with these crossbred cows, that's putting more and more pressure on that paddock.
You're getting too efficient at fertility management, Adrian. You need to you need to stop being so efficient with your fertility. Right, but it's interesting you say that though, isn't it? So this year, 38 cows in 3 acres. For how long would they spend in that 3 acre paddock?
They come in there on an average 21 days before calving, going off the calving dates.
Right, so the calculation would be 38 cows divided by 3 acres times 21 days. So 38 divided by 3 is what, 13-ish, times 21 days. So the only reason I'm sort of dwelling on this for a minute is in the original research, Martin, Andrew played around with stocking density at pasture, and actually it was one of the biggest effect sizes that came out in the research around the mastitis control plan. And for those herds that calved cows outside, moving cows around and not set stocking them, and actually we set a target, if you like, of you could have 100 cows in 1 acre for 1 day, or that equivalent. So if you say, right, I've got 38 cows in 3 acres for 21 days, that's massively in excess of the 100 in 1 acre for 1 day, isn't it? Yeah. So the stocking density is very high. And the reason I bring it up is because actually by doing something about that stocking density, you're going to massively reduce the chance of a high cell count cow calving in. What's the state of play at the moment? How many cows have you got in the close to calving paddock?
We're nearly finished calving, so there's only 7 left, but because of the weather, they've come inside.
Ah, right, okay, yeah. So we've just missed the opportunity, haven't we, to do something about it. It's a shame, and it's one of those things. I know we spoke a couple of weeks ago, but it is one of those things for block calving herds. And if there's anybody on the call that's a spring block calving herd, you know, now is the time to think about what's going to happen with dry cow environments this winter. But for autumn calving herds, you know, when we start drying off in June, we really need to think ahead about what's going to happen towards the back end. But I would massively encourage you, no more than 2 weeks in any one area. So if you've got dry cows outside, no more than 2 weeks in any one area. And what came out of the research really strongly was 4 weeks rest of any area used. Now, I know that gets a little bit iffy when we're thinking about grass growth and standing hay and that sort of thing, but you get the idea that moving pods of dry cows around and dividing up the paddock. It's interesting, this paddock's close to the house, obviously, so I know, you know, absolutely understand why you use it, but it ends up being heavily contaminated, doesn't it? Is there anywhere else you could use, or what's the alternatives here?
Well, having had the conversation with you a couple of weeks ago, we do have a shed right next to that paddock, so the plan would be for next summer would be to put the cows on cubicles for sort of 2-3 weeks, and that, like the snatch approach, and actually put them out to calve in the field, so they'd only be the ones that were expected to calve in the next 24 hours actually in the field. The rest of them would be inside on cubicles.
Right, okay, yeah, and so it truly becomes a calving paddock rather than a dry cow and calving cow paddock. So, right, so that'll manage the numbers. How are you going to do your cubicles? What are your cubicles bedded with, and that sort of thing?
We bed the cubicles, we clean them off and bed them with sawdust every day.
Yeah, good. Okay, so sawdust daily. How many cubicles have you got, Adrian, and how many cows would be in there?
We would create enough cubicles to, yeah, we've got plenty of cubicles, that's not a problem.
Ah, good, oh, right, so you'd have plenty in there, and a bit of, would you have a bit of sort of loafing space, a bit of additional space that we can sort of dilute the cows into? Have they got access to a bit of an outside yard or very wide passageways or things like that?
No, not really, unfortunately not, no. We're
Okay.
either in or out, we can't.
Yeah, okay, so no, understood, but at least you can give them plenty of room in terms of numbers of cubicles then, so they've got a bit of a run of the shed. Yeah, good.
Adrian, just had another question come in. Do you, drying off, do you use sealant and antibiotic tubes?
For the last couple of years, because we haven't milk recorded, we have blanket track with Albany Extra. We used to be on Kepravin, but we had quite an issue with E. coli in lactating cows. So on the advice of the vet, we changed to Albany, and it does seem to have quite substantially reduced the E. coli cases during lactation. But yeah, we only blanket treat, and no, we don't teat seal. We are going to do cell counts for the next every month for the next 12 months, and we're going to have a more targeted approach in the next summer.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm glad that question's come in then, because working backwards, if you like, and like you say, I mean, it will all be now about what happens next year, but working backwards from the late dry period, we're thinking about the early dry period, and we're thinking about the environment that early dry period cows come into, and particularly cows that, you know, that have just been dried off. So if we've dried off a nice low cell count cow, we'll come on to the therapy in a minute. But if we dried off a nice low cell count cow, where does she go, Adrian? So early dry period cows through the summer?
We just graze them on the paddocks that we've got. Generally the longer paddocks, or some get moved down to the other farm, and again we're targeted just onto longer paddocks wherever the grass is getting away from us, really.
Yeah. What's the sort of the typical mob size for a true dry cow group? How many would you have?
30.
So and similar sorts of things. So 30 cows. What's the smallest paddock they might be in?
Well, they tend to move. We end up basically rotating them around daily, so very rarely fastened on the same
Yeah,
paddock, maybe 3-4 days, maybe before they moved at most.
right, excellent. So actually that's something then that's clearly unlikely to be associated with risk of infection then. So freshly dried off cows, low cell count, they're going to enter a system whereby mobs of cows are moved regularly around paddocks. So it really does put massive emphasis on that end bit, doesn't it? That, you know, they're all funneled through that one small paddock at the end, whereas actually earlier on in the dry period, they're moved around on a regular basis. Excellent. So then working backwards one more step, you know, was that question we had about what do we actually do with them at drying off then? I suppose it's more of a general comment. I don't know how many people on the call would also not be in the habit of using teat sealant. Any comments come in, James, about people who also don't use sealant?
No, we haven't, I'm afraid, but we have had a question which slightly on topic. Just wondering, James, if you've had any experience or there is any data on the use of non-antibiotic dry cow therapy.
Well, non-antibiotic dry cow therapy is by definition internal teat sealant.
Sealant, yes.
Unless we're talking about other products that are marketed. So I would much rather, please, put my faith in internal teat sealants. If we talk about non-antibiotic dry cow therapy, that equals internal teat sealants. If people want to go and play around with other things, that's absolutely fine. But all the research evidence, and I wanted to make this point, if you think about a product, you know, in sort of dairy, probably it's the single thing with the most research evidence around it. You know, so internal teat sealants, there's 18 publications worldwide. In fact, there's so much information now from different countries, New Zealand, Australia, Holland, you know, the UK obviously was world leading with this. John Huxley, Andrew Bradley, Martin Green in 2001 with the original teat seal product. You know, all that stuff, that sheer weight of evidence, and they all agree, you know, you are significantly likely to reduce the risk of new infection across the dry period using an internal teat sealant.
So a comment that's just come in to back that up, James. Somebody said they've tried it. It was a big mistake. We lost lots of quarters. Definitely need to use a sealant.
Sorry, definitely need to use a sealant. So
yeah, so that I presume that they were not using a teat sealant at drying off. Right. So they're saying it's a big mistake. They lost a lot of quarters. You definitely need to use a sealant. Yeah, okay, so it's interesting then I don't know what the speculation is. We used something else that wasn't an antibiotic. No, okay. I mean, certainly we absolutely must use internal teat sealants. The research evidence is so strong, you know, not to use it. And I know it's sort of been a bit in vogue. We're sort of not using antibiotic dry cow therapy in low cell count cows. And some people have, you know, gone even further than that and not used anything in low cell count cows at drying off. All cows at drying off must receive an internal teat sealant. That's very much the mantra. Talking about losing quarters, you know, what is absolutely vital, of course, is that we are, you know, surgically clean when we are administering any dry cow therapy, actually, even when it's antibiotic. You know, people seem to think that because it's antibiotic, we just shove it up there and it'll be fine. But any dry cow therapy, antibiotic dry cow or internal teat sealant, that we are surgically clean. And, you know, I would absolutely signpost people on the call to the little YouTube video we did. Don't want to teach anyone how to suck eggs, absolutely. But when people say it's attention to detail or whatever, you know, what detail? Pre-milking teat disinfection, dry white, cotton wool, surgical spirit, you know, there's actually things that we do. And I would ask James, you know, to signpost you to that YouTube video. But yes, I mean, as far as the antibiotic thing goes, an interesting Adrian saying there, they used to use the Kepvin product, they now use the Orban Extra products. The research is done to show that if we put antibiotic
dry cow into a low cell count cow at drying off, yes, you do increase the risk of that cow, if you like, being reported with a coliform mastitis event, a clinical mastitis event in the next lactation, where the causal pathogen is more likely to be E. coli. And so there is good reason not to put antibiotic dry cow into a low cell count cow at drying off. Just use the sealant.
Okay. Apologies, I've done a terrible job today of keeping us to time. We have run over. James, final points from yourself?
Yeah, I think I was going to sort of just say, what do we do now? I mean, really, we sort of come to the end of it. What we do now, actually, is we absolutely think about dry cow management next season. Yes, we've missed the boat, unfortunately, and it's a bit of a shame, but there are key interventions, and you got the idea from Adrian that there's some big wins here for next season around internal teat sealant at drying off, around infusion technique, and cotton wool and surgical spirit and that sort of thing. It sounds like the early part of the dry period and the system is probably going to be associated with less risk, but the late part of the dry period and the common calving paddock and the stocking density was absolutely the killer, and probably has been every season. It's really got away from us now. So we've got a plan in place to limit that. And I would signpost people on the call, if you're interested in dry cow management stuff, please, the resource material that is part of the Quarter Pro scheme around dry cow environment management, there you go. I mean, where Adrian sits now, of course, is we're looking ahead a little bit, and we've got to get through the winter. So actually, in the meantime, we probably need to be measuring new infection rate in lactation to make sure and reassure ourselves that that bit tends to go well. So as long as our new infections in lactation are under control, and we can keep a lid on that, we'll get towards drying off next year. But your long-term control will definitely be about dry cow management with Adrian. That's the pattern.
Adrian, come to you, your thoughts just on discussions we've had with James before today and what you've heard today. What are you thinking for next year that you're going to be doing differently?
We're definitely going to cell count to test the cows for this lactation, and then we can have strategic dry cow management. We have quite frequently tested the cows when we've had mastitis case and cultured it, and we're looking at about 80% of our clinical mastitis cases are E. coli. So that's definitely pointing a very interesting comment that actually treating a low cell count cow increases the risk of E. coli. If we could get rid of our E. coli cases of mastitis, we will be down below 5% in the herd. We're running at the moment about 25%. So yeah, that's very, very interesting. So we're certainly looking forward to being able to be selective in our dry cow therapy, and we will have a just-in-time approach of having the cows in cubicles and calving them next door. We could move them around the paddocks, but these crossbred cows, unfortunately, a few of them are quite lively and refuse to come in with the calf, so you end up having to gather the whole of the paddock in to get your one lively awkward cow. That is the only downside of the crossbreds. The Holsteins used to follow the calves in, every single one of them, so we do have to have them in a quite local paddock, so we can obviously extract the new calf cows easily.
Can I just come back? Can I just come back to Adrian? Sorry, James. Adrian, with your comment about the E. coli diagnosis. So the vast majority of your clinical cases being caused by E. coli as the pathogen. The other thing, of course, is they will have picked that up in the late dry period. How we know that, it'd be interesting if you went back to your clinical cases or even put them into your uniform agri database. I wonder how many of them would be in cows that were less than 30 days in milk. So how many of these clinical mastitis events turn up in cows that are less than 30 days in milk? They are very, very likely to be infection that the cow acquired when she was dry. And so it comes back to this calving paddock again as a bit of a soup, if you like, you know, of environmental infection pressure.
I think that'll be a good question to readdress when we come back to the impact group on the 25th of November. I apologise. We are really short of time. It comes as no surprise that we were only going to touch the tip of the iceberg. So, if anybody is touch the tip of the iceberg today, discussing what we have been. So if anybody is wanting to follow this up, discuss in a bit more detail with James and Adrian, please do let me know, and we can add you to the attendee list for the impact group on the 25th of November. James, Adrian, thanks very much for your time today. We've had some really good discussion, a lot of food for thought there. Do have a look on the AHDB website on the strategic dairy farms. Have a look at Adrian's page, the story, and follow us for more meetings coming up next year. But again, thanks everyone for your input today. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for attending, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.